They did not conquer China with armies. They conquered it with ledgers, loyalty, and a network so vast, so silent, so perfectly engineered that by the time anyone understood what had happened, it was already over. The British government gets the credit in the history books. Generals are celebrated. Admirals have their portraits painted. But the real architect of 19th century trade dominance in Asia was not a viceroy or a commodore. He was a Jewish refugee from Baghdad who arrived in Bombay in 1832 with almost nothing and died one of the wealthiest men on earth. His name was David Sassoon, and his family at their peak controlled roughly 70% of the opium flowing into China, a commercial operation so profitable, so vertically integrated, so geographically vast that it made the Rothschilds look like modest provincial bankers. This is not a story taught in schools. It is not a story that appears in the standard colonial histories. It has been quietly folded into footnotes and forgotten. Until now. Baghdad, 1828. David Sassoon was not a poor man's son. He was born into the innermost circle of Jewish high society in Ottoman Iraq. His father, Sheikh Sassoon ben Saleh, held the most powerful position a Jewish man could hold in the entire region. Nasi, the official treasurer and representative of the Jewish community to the Ottoman authorities. The Sassoon family lived in a world of influence, of formal dinners with pashas, of commercial networks stretching from Baghdad to Basra. But influence in the Ottoman world was always precarious. It depended entirely on the temperament of whoever sat at the top. When Dawood Pasha, the ruler of Baghdad, began to slide into paranoia, the calculation changed overnight. Dawood Pasha had grown suspicious of the wealthy, the connected, the foreign adjacent. He began seizing assets. Merchants disappeared into interrogation. The rules that had protected families like the Sassoons for generations suddenly meant nothing. David Sassoon made the only rational decision available to a man who valued his freedom more than his furniture. He left, first to Bushehr on the Persian coast, then, after years of careful positioning, to Bombay. He arrived in 1832, aged roughly 40, with his sons, his faith, his language, Arabic and Hebrew and Judeo-Baghdadi dialect, and a commercial instinct sharpened by decades of watching how power and trade intersected. He arrived and he looked at Bombay with clear eyes, and he began to plan. The strategic genius of David Sassoon was not what he learned, it was what he refused to forget. Every immigrant who arrived in British India faced the same social pressure: assimilate, take an English name, wear English clothes, speak English at the dinner table, disappear into the colonial fabric. Hundreds of merchant families did exactly this, trading their identity for acceptance, and finding, often enough, that the acceptance was never quite complete anyway. David Sassoon refused. He kept his name. He kept his long robes. He kept his language. He kept the Sabbath so strictly that his offices in Bombay, Calcutta, and eventually across Asia were closed on Saturdays, an extraordinary commercial sacrifice that nevertheless never slowed his growth. He built his business not on English trust, but on Baghdadi Jewish trust, a network of men who had fled the same cities, who spoke the same dialects, who shared the same faith and the same understanding of what it meant to be outside every official system. His sons were the nodes of this network. He had 8 of them, and he deployed them like a general deploys officers, each to a different port, each fluent in 5 or 6 languages, each bound to the family firm by blood and by an understanding that the network only worked if every node was reliable. This was not sentiment. This was architecture. And it worked because David had identified something that the British East India Company, for all its warships and bureaucrats, could not easily solve. The company grew opium in Bengal, vast fields of it processed at government facilities in Patna and Benares, packed into chests, auctioned in Calcutta. But getting it into China was another matter entirely. The Chinese imperial government had banned the trade. This did not stop demand, quite the opposite, but it meant that any sale required operating in the shadows through intermediaries, through channels that official British commercial and diplomatic representatives could not touch without creating an incident. What was needed was a merchant who was not British, who was not Chinese, who existed, commercially speaking, in the spaces between empires, who had the trust networks, the linguistic range, and the flexible relationship with official rules that the situation demanded. David Sassoon was, almost perfectly, that man. The arrangement that developed was elegant in its logic. The company auctioned the opium in Calcutta. Sassoon and Company bought it. Sassoon Ships, the family would eventually own a fleet of 23 vessels, carried it east. Sassoon agents in Canton and Hong Kong and Singapore managed the final distribution through networks of Chinese merchants who had their own reasons to work outside official channels. The profit margin on a single chest was extraordinary. 400% was not unusual. In the year 1850, the family's annual revenue from this trade alone translated, in modern purchasing power, to roughly $120 million per year. And because David was, above all, a man who understood that visible wealth without legitimacy was dangerous, those profits were immediately redirected into cotton mills, into the first passenger railway in India, into hospitals, synagogues, schools, into the kind of philanthropic infrastructure that made the British press describe David Sassoon as, in their own words, a civilizing force, a builder, a benefactor, a man of vision. They were not entirely wrong. He was all of those things. They simply did not look too carefully at the source of the funds that made the building possible. When David Sassoon died in 1864, the obituaries were respectful, even admiring. His fortune, estimated at the equivalent of $75 million, had been built in 32 years from nothing. From a refugee's landing, from a refusal to disappear. He had created not just a business, but a machine. A living network of trusted agents, loyal sons, legal structures layered across 4 countries, and commercial relationships so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of Asian trade that removing the Sassoons from the picture would have required dismantling the picture itself. His sons would inherit that machine, and they would take it somewhere their father had never imagined, to a mudflat on the Chinese coast, to a city that did not yet exist, to Shanghai. There's a photograph taken on the Bund in Shanghai in 1935. In the foreground, a man in an immaculate white linen suit, leaning slightly on a silver-tipped cane, squinting into the afternoon light with the expression of someone surveying territory he already owns. Behind him, a skyline of Art Deco towers, banking houses, hotels, and trading floors that would not look out of place in Manhattan or London. The man is Victor Sassoon. The skyline is, in very large part, his. What the photograph does not show, what no photograph could show, is how that skyline was built. Whose labor? Whose land? Whose century of carefully constructed dominance made it possible for one family of Iraqi Jewish refugees to look out over a Chinese city and see essentially a private estate? To understand Victor, you have to go back 90 years, back to the mud. Shanghai, 1845, before the towers, before the race course, and the jazz clubs and the grand hotel lobbies, before any of it. The Bund in 1845 was a riverbank, literally, a strip of muddy embankment along the Huangpu River, lined with warehouses and godowns, smelling of river water and rope and commerce in its rawest, most unromantic form. The city behind it was a Chinese market town of modest regional importance. The foreign settlements, British, French, American, were new, nervous, and still figuring out what they were allowed to do. This was precisely the moment Elias Sassoon arrived. He came with a direct mandate from his father David, expressed in terms that David Sassoon favored: clear, commercial, and entirely unsentimental. The instruction, as family correspondence preserved it, was essentially this: establish dominance before anyone understands what this city will become. It was, in retrospect, one of the great pieces of commercial foresight in the 19th century. Elias set up the first Sassoon office in Shanghai in a wooden structure on the Bund. He was not there for comfort. He was there to plant a flag, to establish the relationships, the reputation, and the physical presence that would allow the family to move first on every significant opportunity as the city grew. And the city grew faster than almost anyone predicted. The key to understanding how the Sassoons operated in China is a single word: compradors. A comprador, from the Portuguese "the," was a Chinese merchant who served as the essential bridge between foreign business interests and the local economy. They were translators in the deepest sense, not just of language, but of custom, relationship, hierarchy, and the 1,000 unspoken rules that govern commerce in Chinese society. Without a comprador, a foreign businessman in Shanghai was functionally blind. He could not negotiate with local suppliers. He could not navigate the clan networks that controlled distribution in the interior. He could not even know half the time who the real decision maker in a given transaction actually was. The Sassoons did not simply hire compradors. They built a system around them. Over decades, the family cultivated a layered network of Chinese intermediaries, each connected to the next, each with their own sphere of local influence, each owing their commercial position in some measure to the Sassoon relationship. When a new business opportunity emerged in the city, the Sassoon comprador network knew about it first. When a competitor tried to establish a foothold, the network made the entry cost quietly, persistently higher. It was not monopoly in the legal sense, it was something more durable. Monopoly through relationship, through trust, through the accumulated weight of being there first and staying longest. The fracture of 1867 nearly destroyed everything. David Sassoon died in 1864, and almost immediately the question of succession produced the answer that family empires have produced throughout history: conflict. Two of his sons, Joris, Abdullah, who inherited the main firm, and Elias, who had built Shanghai, could not agree on direction, on authority, on the fundamental question of who was in charge of what. The disagreement was genuine, deep, and probably irreconcilable from the moment it began. By 1867, Elias had broken away entirely, establishing a separate firm, E.D. Sassoon and Company. On paper, this was simply a business restructuring. In practice, it meant that the most powerful trading family in Asia was now competing with itself. Two firms, both bearing the Sassoon name, both drawing on the same networks, both fighting for the same contracts and the same commercial territory. Rivals watched with barely concealed delight. American traders who had struggled for years to find footholds in markets the Sassoons controlled suddenly found the pricing more negotiable, the relationships less locked in, the doors slightly more open. The cousins never reconciled. For decades, the two branches of the family traded against each other in ports from Bombay to Yokohama, spending energy and capital on internal competition that could have been directed outward. It was the first great wound in the Sassoon story. It would not be the last. And then came Victor. Sir Victor Sassoon, 3rd Baronet, Cambridge-educated, Royal Flying Corps veteran, was not, on the surface, what you would expect from the heir to a commercial dynasty built on discipline and religious observance. He was a socialite, a horse racing enthusiast, a man who threw legendary parties at his estate in Suffolk and who maintained simultaneously the most glamorous address book in Asia. He was photographed constantly, at the races, at dinners, at the kinds of gatherings where the guest list included everyone who mattered in the connected world of 1920s international finance and society. He also walked with a pronounced limp, the result of a crash during his service as a pilot in the First World War, an injury that had ended his military career and given him, by his own account, a particular clarity about the relationship between risk and reward. That clarity turned out to be the most valuable thing about him, because Victor looked at the family's remaining opium interests in the 1920s and understood, with absolute cold-eyed certainty, that the trade was finished. International pressure was building. Agreements were being signed. The political cost of association with the business was rising faster than the commercial returns. The window was closing. He pivoted. Completely, decisively, without sentiment, the new business was real estate. Specifically, Shanghai real estate. Even more specifically, the Bund. Victor's theory was elegant. Shanghai by the 1920s was the 5th largest city in the world. It was the financial capital of Asia, the meeting point of every major commercial interest from London to Tokyo. The international settlement, the foreign-administered district where the Sassoons had always operated, was legally distinct from China proper, governed by its own municipal council, protected by its own police force, operating under its own rules. It was, in effect, a city-state inside a city. And real estate in a city-state that served as Asia's financial hub was, Victor calculated, about the most reliable store of value on earth. He bought everything he could: warehouses, office buildings, residential blocks, commercial lots. He bought land that other investors considered overpriced and held it until the overpricing became obvious foresight. He bought properties that needed renovation and renovated them to a standard that reset expectations for the entire district. And then, in 1926, he built the Cathay Hotel, 10 stories, Art Deco facade, a copper green pyramid roof visible from ships entering the harbor. The Cathay cost the equivalent of $75 million in today's money. It was, at its opening, the finest hotel in Asia, and by some measures, one of the finest in the world. The rooms were appointed with the kind of detail that communicated not just luxury, but permanence. This was not a building that expected to be replaced. Noel Coward wrote Private Lives in Suite 33 during a fever, famously claiming the illness had been the most productive of his life. Charlie Chaplin stayed there. The Duke of Windsor and Wallace Simpson occupied it during their controversial tour of Asia. Every significant business negotiation in Shanghai passed through its lobbies or its private dining rooms. But the Cathay was more than a hotel. It was a statement. It said, "The Sassoons are not guests in the city. They are not tenants. They are not foreign merchants operating at the sufferance of a local authority. They are the authority. They set the standard. They define what Shanghai is." By 1930, the family's real estate holdings across the city were so extensive that they could, and did, influence land prices across entire districts simply by deciding whether or not to sell a given property. American banks looking to establish a presence on the Bund found that every premium location was either owned by Sassoon interests or tied up in relationships that made acquisition prohibitively expensive. They paid, because the alternative was irrelevance. And underneath all of it, beneath the hotel lobbies and the racing horses and the Art Deco towers, ran a darker current. Victor's relationship with Du Yuesheng was not a secret in Shanghai. Du was the leader of the Green Gang, the most powerful criminal organization in the city, a man who controlled the waterfront labor, the shadow economy, and enough of the municipal police to make him effectively untouchable. The arrangement between them was the kind that powerful men in complicated cities have always made with each other. Du's organization provided security, labor compliance, and the quiet resolution of problems that official channels could not or would not handle. Victor's legitimate business empire provided the legal structures, the banking relationships, and the social respectability that Du could never access directly. Neither man spoke publicly about the arrangement. Neither needed to. By 1935, Victor Sassoon's personal fortune was the equivalent of $1.2 billion. He owned more of Shanghai than any other single individual. He sat at the center of a web that connected British finance, Chinese commerce, and the shadow economy of the most complex city on Earth. He had taken his grandfather's refugee network and turned it into something his grandfather could never have imagined. He had made himself for one extraordinary decade the king of Shanghai. He did not understand yet how quickly a king could be made a fugitive. Every empire has a final year. A year when the foundations are still intact, the towers still standing, the ledgers still balanced, but something has shifted beneath the surface. Some invisible load-bearing wall has cracked, and the men at the top either feel it and act, or they do not feel it and are buried. For the Sassoon Empire in Shanghai, that year was 1937. Victor Sassoon felt it. That was the thing about him. Beneath the linen suits and the racetrack glamour and the legendary parties, there was always that cold, clear, pilot's eye calculation of risk. The same instinct that had told him to abandon opium before the window closed would tell him, again, when the time came, to move. But between feeling it and acting on it, there were years. And in those years, the city burned, and Victor Sassoon made money from the burning. That is the part the history books leave out. August 1937, Japanese forces had been pressing into northern China for years. The Marco Polo Bridge incident in July had escalated into open war. And in August, the battle came to Shanghai itself, to the streets, the river, the districts just beyond the edges of the international settlement. The settlement itself remained, for the moment, technically neutral. It was foreign-administered territory, protected by international treaty, and Japan, still calculating its relationship with Britain and America, chose not to move against it directly. Not yet. This created a situation of extraordinary, almost surreal contrast. On one side of an invisible line, war, artillery, displacement, hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians fleeing the fighting, carrying whatever they could, looking for somewhere to go. On the other side of that line, the international settlement, still functioning, still lit at night, still operating its banks and its hotels and its race courses with a determination that looked, from the outside, either like remarkable resilience or breathtaking moral detachment, depending on where you stood. Victor Sassoon stood on the profitable side of the line. The refugees came in waves. Wealthy Chinese families from the surrounding districts, merchants, professionals, landowners, arrived in the settlement with cash, with jewelry, with the portable remnants of lives that had been comfortable until very recently. They needed accommodation immediately. They needed it in a place that was, for the moment, safe. Victor raised rents across his properties by 200 to 300%. The calculation was straightforward. Demand was effectively infinite, supply was fixed, and the people paying were the ones who could still afford to pay. Those who could not afford the new rates moved on to whatever they could find. Victor did not set policy based on what people could afford. He set it based on what the market would bear. He also bought. Chinese property owners caught on the wrong side of events, people whose assets were in occupied territory, whose businesses had been destroyed, whose financial position had collapsed overnight, sometimes needed to liquidate Shanghai holdings quickly at whatever price they could get. Victor's representatives were available. The prices they offered were low. The sellers accepted because the alternative was nothing. It was legal. It was rational, by the logic of markets. It was also by the reckoning of the people on the other side of those transactions, something considerably darker. Then came the 20,000. Shanghai had, in 1938 and 39, one extraordinary distinction among the cities of the world. It required no visa. While country after country closed its borders, while embassies across Europe stamped rejection after rejection into the passports of desperate families, Shanghai's international settlement simply did not ask. You arrived? You were there? That was sufficient. 20,000 Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria came through that door. They arrived with almost nothing. Exit taxes and confiscations had seen to that, and they crowded into the Hangzhou district, a neighborhood already dense with Chinese residents, building a community of bakeries and newspapers and amateur theater companies and all the other human machinery of people determined to remain human under impossible conditions. They needed housing. Victor Sassoon owned housing. The rents he charged them were not charitable. They were market rates. The same elevated market rates he charged everyone in a city where demand had been artificially inflated by catastrophe. The refugees paid because they had no alternative. Victor collected because he saw no reason not to. Later, much later, some accounts would credit Victor with generosity toward the refugee community. Donations, occasional reductions, gestures of solidarity. These things existed. They sat alongside the rent extraction without canceling it out. Both were true simultaneously, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about Victor Sassoon. He was capable of genuine generosity and systematic exploitation at the same time, often toward the same people, and he did not appear to experience significant tension between the two. December 1941. Pearl Harbor. And within hours, everything changed. Japan moved against the international settlement. The neutrality that had protected the foreign enclave for 4 years evaporated in a single morning. Japanese military administration replaced the municipal council. Foreign nationals were classified as enemy subjects. Victor Sassoon was interned. He spent a portion of the occupation under Japanese administrative control, not in the harshest conditions available, but under restriction. Monitored, limited. The king of Shanghai reduced to a subject of someone else's authority. But here is what the internment record does not show. The months before December 1941, Victor had been moving money for years, quietly, systematically, through the layered structures of international finance that his family had spent a century building. Assets converted to forms that could travel, gold, securities, holdings in Bombay and London and Nassau. The Shanghai Empire was enormous. What he managed to extract before the door closed was, by later estimates, roughly 60% of its total value. He had felt the wall cracking. He had acted. The internment was an inconvenience. The real game had already been played. After the war, he came back. 1946, the Japanese gone. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek nominally in control. Shanghai attempting with exhausted determination to reassemble itself. Victor returned to the Cathay Hotel, to the race course, to the social rituals of a city that was trying very hard to pretend the last decade had not happened. There were parties again. There were horses. There was, for a brief and slightly desperate interval, something that looked from a distance like the old Shanghai. Victor watched all of it with that pilot's eye, and what he saw was an economy consuming itself. The nationalist government was printing money to cover war debts, and the currency was collapsing. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a free fall that wiped out savings in weeks. A professor's monthly salary in 1948 bought what a single cup of tea had cost in 1937. The middle class that had survived the Japanese occupation was being liquidated by inflation. Meanwhile, in the North and the West, the communist forces of Mao Zedong were advancing, city by city, province by province. The nationalist military, riddled with the particular corruption of a government that had already lost faith in itself, was retreating faster than official announcements acknowledged. Most foreign businessmen were waiting. They had waited through the Japanese occupation. They could wait through a civil war. Things had a way of stabilizing. Victor did not wait. In the second half of 1948, he liquidated, quietly, without announcement, through intermediaries and staged transactions and the kind of financial choreography that requires both skill and advanced preparation. Properties were sold, not all at once, which would have triggered questions and panic, but in a rhythm that looked, to anyone watching, like ordinary portfolio management. Holdings were restructured. Leases were transferred. The horses, Victor's beloved racehorses, the most visible symbol of his Shanghai life, were sold. When the outbound ship left Shanghai harbor in late 1948, Victor Sassoon was on it. He did not make a speech. He did not hold a farewell dinner. He simply left in the way that people leave when they are not planning to return and do not wish to draw attention to the fact. Behind him, the city continued its final act. May 1949. The People's Liberation Army entered Shanghai. The nationalist government had already fled to Taiwan. The foreign settlements, the treaty port system, the entire legal architecture that had made the Sassoon Empire possible, all of it ceased to exist within weeks. The Cathay Hotel was nationalized. The new government renamed it the Peace Hotel, a name it carries to this day. Sassoon House, the headquarters of the family's commercial operations, became a government office building. The comprador networks were dissolved. The land holdings were transferred to state ownership. 117 years of construction, gone in a matter of months, but not entirely gone. Not for Victor. The 60% he had extracted, the gold, the securities, the foreign holdings, traveled with him to Nassau, in the Bahamas, where he established a new life of comfortable, sun-drenched retirement. There were still horses. There were still parties, smaller ones, on a quieter scale. There was the silver shadow and the afternoon light on the water and the reasonable satisfaction of a man who had, by his own accounting, played a very long and complicated game and come out ahead. Mao's government in these years was publicly executing opium dealers. The trade that had founded the Sassoon fortune, the trade that David had built in 1832 from nothing, was now a capital crime in the country where it had been conducted. The men who actually handled the product, the distributors and the middlemen and the local operators, faced consequences that were, in some cases, final. The architects of the system died in their beds. Victor Sassoon died in Nassau in 1961. His estate was valued at $100 million, the equivalent of approximately $1 billion today. He left much of it to medical research. His obituaries were respectful. The London Times noted his contribution to Shanghai's architectural heritage. The Peace Hotel still stands on the Bund. Tourists stay there. They photograph the Art Deco lobby, the high ceilings, the copper-green pyramid roof visible from the river. The hotel markets its history, the famous guests, the Jazz Age glamour, The sense of being in a place where the 20th century happened at full intensity. What it does not market, what the plaques do not mention, and the concierge does not explain, is the specific chain of events that caused it to be built. The opium fields of Bengal, the refugees landing in Bombay, the comprador networks and the currency manipulation, and the rent extraction during wartime, and the quiet liquidation before the door closed. History, when it is comfortable enough, becomes atmosphere. The suffering that funded the architecture recedes. What remains is the building. The Sassoons are gone from Shanghai, gone from Bombay. Dispersed across London and New York and Tel Aviv and Nassau, the descendants of David's 8 sons living lives that would be, in most cases, unrecognizable to their ancestor. Comfortable, professional, ordinary lives. 3 or 4 generations removed from the machinery that made them possible. The machine itself has been dismantled. The records are scattered. The empire is a footnote. But here's the question that the footnote cannot answer. What is the correct moral accounting for a family that survived by being useful to systems that caused enormous harm, and that also built hospitals and railways, and employed thousands, and opened a city to refugees when no one else would? What do we do with the fact that the same fortune funded both the Cathay Hotel and the opium chests? That the same man who raised rents on wartime refugees also, sometimes, reduced them? That the system was brutal, and the people inside it were human and complicated, and not simply villains? The British Empire gets the large-scale moral reckoning in the history books. The Sassoons, who were both products of that empire and independent operators within it, who were themselves refugees and also the architects of other people's misery, exist in a more uncomfortable space. They were not the British government. They were not acting under orders. They made choices repeatedly over more than a century, and the choices compounded. The Peace Hotel stands on the Bund. The tourists take their photographs, and somewhere in the ledgers that no one reads anymore. In the shipping manifests and the property records, and the comprador contracts, and the currency transfers. The full accounting waits, patient and silent, for someone to add it up.